increasingly in our culture today, having a willingness and an ability within the church to kind of come clean about what we're struggling with, whatever it is, you name it, for all of us to be able to come alongside one another in those struggles against sin and to be the encouragement that we need. That's actually an incredibly sort of mentally healthy community to be part of, because nobody's pretending. And, if your struggle is with depression, or your struggle is with anxiety, or your struggle is with suicidal ideation, that should be something that we, as brothers and sisters in Christ, are able to come alongside one another and give each other the sort of love and encouragement that we need in the midst of all of those struggles.
Rebecca McLaughlin is a well-known speaker and author of a number of best-selling books, including Confronting Christianity, Confronting Jesus, Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, and brand new from Crossway, How Church Could Literally Save Your Life. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining me today on the Crossway podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So the premise of this new book that you've written is, I would say it's pretty bold. It's essentially going to church could literally save your life. And so I wonder if you could just start by sharing some of the maybe high-level stats or the high-level insights that exist today that we back that claim up.
So I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one of the joys of that is being close to some of the top universities in the US, including MIT and Harvard. And several years ago, I became familiar with the work that's coming out of the Harvard School of Public Health. So this particularly a guy named Tyler Vanderbilt, who is leading a group there that's looking at the relationship between religious participation, so what we might sort of historically have called organized religion, and people's mental and physical health outcomes. Now, it's not the only place that's looking at this, but it's certainly sort of one of the world-leading institutions that's looking at these things. And contrary to many people's expectations, I think, especially folks who, like me, grew up in kind of more secularized environments where there was this narrative that said, like, going to church is probably, if anything, bad for your mental health. Actually, going to church every week is extraordinarily good for your mental health. You are less likely to become depressed and more likely to recover from depression if you are going to church once a week or more. You are dramatically less likely to commit suicide, which is obviously a very sort of painful topic for many even to touch on, and there'll be sort of stories that all of us will have of people we've deeply loved who've been in such a mental health crisis that's been the choice they made or the risk that they've been faced with. And I remember when I first read a paper that Tyler Vanderbilt had published on this topic, sort of looking at the fact that women who attend church every week, I think it's 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never attended. I remember emailing Tyler and saying, this seems it's sort of extraordinary. Is this really representative of the research in general? And he said, yeah, no, it actually is. It's perhaps the most protective mechanism that we've discovered when it comes to suicide prevention is regular religious participation.
I wanted to ask about that too. Have you actually met with Tyler? Have you spent time with him, interacting? Yeah. And so what was that? What's his background? Why is he doing this research?
Tyler he's one of the most extraordinarily smart people I've had the pleasure of coming across, because he's somebody who's got degrees in everything from economics to theology. And he's a true academic expert. He himself is a convinced Catholic. And so he, in some ways, would have personal reasons to be very pleased with the results of his work. But he's also, as a very careful academic, absolutely working to make sure that his research is quite robust and not just depending on any observer bias, as it were. And he works with a team that has a diversity of views in terms of their own spiritual beliefs or otherwise. So this is very robust research that's coming out of his institution, and also multiple others working on with large data sets, not only in the US, but also in the UK and other parts of the world. They've been doing some studies that feature all sorts of different countries as well, and looking at the relationship between regular religious participation and the mental and physical health outcomes.
So this isn't just evidence in the US, it's actually global kinds of trends that they can see here.
Yes. Now in the US, most of the research has been done on people who go to church, because that's obviously the vast majority of religious participation that we see. The interesting thing is these effects don't seem to be specific to the religious participation. So, for example, if somebody was going to Jewish services once a week or more, you could expect to see similar effects. They do depend on it being religious, though. So it's not just the social component and the kind of community support of being part of something. In fact, Tyler and his colleagues have studied that, and it accounts for about 25 to 30% of the effect, the sort of the social support piece.
Whereas 75% is the religious.
Yeah, and it's hard to know exactly where that comes from a kind of observational perspective. Obviously, from a Christian perspective, it makes sense to think that if God made humans in his image, designed us for a relationship with him, that we would have a yearning for connection to a sort of spiritual being. And so obviously as Christians, we fully kind of understand that is the God of all the universe who revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. But it's also sort of perhaps not surprising that humans thrive when they have a sense that they are not we're not alone in the universe, and that we're not
the end all be all.
that the universe doesn't actually revolve around us. And this is again something that you can look at other psychologists who've come from very different perspectives, who would say actually humans need work, love, and a sense of connection to something greater than themselves, which of course religious participation provides in spades.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the maybe obvious objections or buts that could come from this is just the kind of cliched phrase, correlation doesn't prove cause and effect. So how do we know that the religious participation is actually causing these beneficial outcomes psychologically, mentally, spiritually, versus just the people who tend to be more psychologically stable perhaps, or healthy in different ways, they tend to be drawn towards church in some way. So how do you think about that question?
Yeah, one of the things I know about myself is I am an expert in very few things, but I'm quite good at finding the experts on various questions. And so that's exactly the kind of challenge that folks in Tyler Mandeville's group are looking at, and trying to eliminate as many factors as possible to figure out that they're actually looking at something that's an effect rather than something that could be explained by some other dimension.
Yeah.
Now, it's for sure the case. Say, for example, when you look at depression, if somebody is already depressed, they are less likely to have the sort of activation energy to go to church, for example. Like that's certainly
to establish and maintain strong relational bonds.
Yes. So there's for sure going to be some of that effect. But if you eliminate that feature, and if you compare sort of like with like,
you
in
can
terms
control
of people,
for those
variables.
variables.
People have the same sort of baseline symptoms in the first place, and then you look at people who do become part of a regular worshiping community versus people who don't. And if you look at people who, perhaps are already embedded in a worshiping community and then become depressed, and look at whether they're more likely to recover from depression if they stay or if they leave, you can see some of these effects by comparing like with like.
Yeah. It's so interesting too that this research is being done now, maybe kind of groundbreaking research on the impact of religious participation in an era that is often referred to as the Great Dechurching. Where we kind of look around and many people are leaving organized religion in big ways. Actually, to start, could you just summarize what we have seen? What are some of the basic trends with this? If someone hasn't ever heard the phrase the Great Dechurching, what does that mean, and kind of what has been happening around us, even if we're not maybe as familiar with it?
Yeah, so in the last 25 years or so, the proportion of people in America who go to church weekly, or who go to church twice a month, or who go to church once a month, all of those populations have been on average decreasing as far as we can see. Now, so there's complexity around some of the data. Some of what we might assume was driving that turns out to not have been the main driver. So in many people's minds, the new atheist movement, the various ways in which people have been caused to sort of question the Christian faith, in particular in the last 25 years, I think in a lot of people's minds, well, that's caused this massive exodus from church, and where people are leaving the church and sort of slamming the door behind them.
Like
and
overt kind of criticisms
yeah,
of
sort of
Christianity.
hardened, Richard Dawkins types who, imagining people kind of growing up in church and then becoming very kind of well thought through skeptics. And for sure, there's some of that. There's been a lot more of what's sometimes been called casual dechurching, i.e. people who maybe used to go to church, then moved to a new city and didn't find a new church, or went through a particular life change, whether it's having children or going through a divorce or, some sort of life change or other that has meant that they didn't end up becoming, again, part of a worshipping community rather than it being something that they really intended, more something that sort of happened.
Yeah, less like a definite decision and more of just kind of didn't get around to it.
Yes. So there's been a surprising proportion of people who've been more in that category. And I think it's fair to say that what we're seeing right now is a resurgence in church attendance. So one of the things I've been kind of saying for the last couple of years is like, yeah, we've seen perhaps a fair bit of dechurching. I think we're now ready for the Great Rechurching, not only in the US but also in the UK where I come from, which is saw church attendance decline well before the US did. I think a lot of the secular tapes are sort of playing out, as in we in Cambridge, Massachusetts are seeing more and more people who grew up without any kind of religious framework and have tried everything that the world has to offer them. Sort of saying, I've tried tarot cards, I've tried crystals, I've tried meditation, I've tried yoga, I've tried sexual relationships with men, I've tried sexual relationships with women, I've you name it, I've tried drugs, I've tried alcohol, and nothing works. Like I still feel meaninglessness in my life. I still am lonely and lack community. I still don't have the answers to the questions that my sort of soul is asking. Showing up at church and saying, tell me about Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think we're actually in a transition phase right now where more and more people are actually being drawn to church, whether it's they used to go to church, they've had a period away and they're coming back, or whether it's people who just have no real religious background and who are realizing that life without God is no way to live.
Yeah, and then there's an openness to...
Yeah,
I wanted to dial in on the kind of mental health side of things. That's where you start in the book. And the media landscape, the news stories that we tend to hear, it's almost always stories of someone was in a church and it was oppressive, it was restrictive, there was abuse, there was some kind of misbehavior. And when someone finally made the hard decision to leave the church, to get out of that, then their mental health really just improved dramatically. I don't know if that resonates with you, but I just feel like the dominant storyline is that, not the other way around where, hey, when you joined a church, then wow, look at how, you got healthier in many different ways. Why do you think that is the dominant storyline that we so often hear?
I think it's the one that fits with the narrative that we've been telling ourselves in the West, or at least in the UK where I grew up for decades, which is that as the world becomes more educated, more sophisticated, more just, more all the good things that we want, it's naturally going to become less religious and in particular less Christian. That there's a sort of association in people's minds between Christianity and a sort of previous regime almost, and a way of thinking that is at odds with many of the values that people in our society hold today. I think, in fact, when you look at the deep substructure of the values that people in our society hold today, many of them turn out to be very Christian. Even people who are landing in quite anti-Christian positions when it comes to, for example, sexuality and gender, are drawing on essentially Christian arguments about universal human equality and rights and care for and protection of the marginalized and sexual consent, actually something that came to us from Christianity.
But this is a really important point because I think sometimes we think of, as conservative Christians, we think of issues of sexuality, say, as a great example, where there is a massive moral chasm between our viewpoint on a biblical sexual ethic and what the prevailing secular culture views. But you're kind of saying that even though there is a big difference at the end results area, there is a shared moral framework perhaps at play still?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a guy called Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland. He's a British
Important
historian.
distinction.
Yes, indeed. And he is not a Christian. He's agnostic himself. Wrote several years ago a really interesting book called Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And he wrote that book, as an agnostic. And in the course of his research of looking at Christianity in the West over the last 2,000 years, he discovered that many of his own deepest moral beliefs are actually Christian beliefs that he doesn't have a grounding for aside from Christianity. And he's very sort of open about that. He says
no good explanation for.
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at the Greco-Roman Empire into which Christianity was born, very different ethical frameworks on all sorts of fronts. Very much a might is right ethos. Sexual consent only applied to certain people, not to others. If you were a freeborn woman, you could expect to have your sort of sexual integrity defended by the men around you,
by the law.
But if you're not free, so if you are enslaved or if you're working as a prostitute, which is often what would happen. I mean, the sort of overlap between the enslaved and those who are working as prostitutes in the ancient world is very, very large. Then those people's bodies just didn't count. Nobody was asking if they were consenting because they didn't matter any more than. It's sort of the ancient equivalent of sex robots in people's minds. And interestingly, from a Greco-Roman sort of man's perspective, it didn't really matter whether you were having sex with somebody who was male or female. It was the role that you were taking was what mattered, not the sort of sex of the other person.
Mm-hmm.
It feels to us today like we're a million miles away from that world, and a lot of people think that that's because of sort of secular progress. That now, thanks to the Enlightenment or thanks to, the moves of sort of secular progress in recent years, that we now recognize that women actually shouldn't be raped and that rape is, morally wrong regardless of the circumstances. And we now realize that it's not okay for the strong and the rich and the powerful to sort of trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized. We now realize that men and women are fundamentally kind of morally equal. All of those are Christian beliefs. And again, sort of going back to Tom Holland, he makes it very clear that even in the debates that we see in our culture around questions of sexuality and gender, both sides are sort of standing on Christian turf as they're hurling grenades, because if you don't have a Christian substructure, you don't have a grounds for saying that rape is actually wrong, not just, something that I don't prefer, a kind of a taste that I happen to have against such a thing, but in fact, like morally wrong. I think our current culture is in some ways more Christian than it realizes. And I say that even when it's landing in very anti-Christian positions.
So you wouldn't deny that some of the conclusions are very anti-Christian. It's just that there's a certain assumptions about the way the world is, the dignity of all human beings,
right.
That kind of thing, that they are kind of unknowingly stealing from a Christian worldview.
Yeah. I mean, you see this very vividly, for example, in questions of pro-life / pro-choice sort of debates, because from a pro-life perspective, and as a Christian, I'm very, very strongly pro-life. I would say, well, the baby in a mother's womb is made in the image of God, regardless of what sort of stage of development that baby is at. This is a human being, and their life is precious. And non-believing friends of mine who might feel passionately pro-choice, they would say it's absolutely unfair and unjust and cruel to especially poor women who have an unexpected pregnancy and don't have the ability to provide for their child, especially for women who've been raped or have had sort of terrible things happen to them. It's completely immoral to expect that woman to bear a child who she didn't intend to conceive. And so there's a sort of profound concern for that vulnerable woman.
Mm.
Now, why do we have a concern for the vulnerable woman? Actually, it's because of Christianity.
Mm.
So, one way of looking at it is to say, if there is no God and if Jesus isn't who he claims to be, and if his teachings about both men and women and about children and infants are not worth us standing on, then the baby in the mother's womb is just a collection of atoms and molecules. has no moral value whatsoever. But if there is no God and if Jesus isn't who he claims to be and we can't sort of stake our lives on his teachings, then that's just what the mother is as well. That's just what you are. That's just what I am. We're nothing but atoms and molecules. At best, we're mammals.
Yeah.
And we know, rape is very common in the animal world. And we don't sort of seek to legislate the sexual behavior of animals because we know they're not making moral decisions in the ways that we are. So why do we think that we're making those moral decisions? Why do I even think that I'm a valid moral agent? It's all because of Christianity.
And that just becomes purely arbitrary in a secular kind of worldview. Yeah.
Yeah, and people will passionately believe things that their non-belief in God does not support.
I love one of the stories that you tell in the book is about a friend of yours who their life was kind of dramatically changed through their decision to commit to a church and kind of get involved in a church. I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about that story and just kind of give us one glimpse into an actual person's experience of joining a church.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this is a young friend of mine who joined our church about 18 months ago, grown up in a non-church going family and had all the freedoms that in our kind of modern culture we think are a blessing to
make
young
us
people.
Happy.
Yeah, so she had all the freedom to sleep with who she wanted to take whatever substances she wanted to take. She quite early developed an alcohol addiction and was living a sort of very free and unconstrained life. She actually first heard the gospel when she was a student studying abroad in Madrid in Spain and heard a beauty YouTuber who she was following for kind of makeup tips, clicked on the video by this woman and she explained how Jesus had saved her from an eating disorder. And my friend was so kind of moved by this. She'd never heard the gospel before. She'd truly never heard the message.
Literally never heard it.
Yeah, she just didn't know what the claim of Christianity was. And she was so moved by it, she was sort of weeping in her little dorm room in Madrid, started going to a church for a few weeks there because she thought, this is amazing. I need to find out what's going on here with this Christianity stuff. But after a few weeks of going to that church, her boyfriend and her friends and her family were all sort of saying, this is ridiculous. What are you doing? Like, you can't be a Christian. Like, Christians are stupid. Christians are bigots. Christians, you name it. And after a few weeks, she thought, maybe they're right. It is crazy, and it's going to require way too many changes in my life to actually be serious about following Jesus. So she stopped going to church, moved back to Boston, started actually dating women exclusively after a number of experiences with men that she'd sort of found disappointing. And so I think for about 18 months she was exclusively dating other women. But even during that time, she couldn't quite get Jesus out of her mind, and she kept listening to podcasts and starting to read books, and then sort of halfway through getting, she read my friend Rachel Gilson's book, Born Again This Way, got halfway through it on her Kindle and then deleted it from her Kindle because she, as she puts it now, it made her angry. She didn't want to repent, and she was sort of, she wanted to kind of expunge it from her reading record. But then eventually, months later, got to the point of saying, actually, I've truly tried everything. Like, I've tried tarot cards and crystals and meditation and astrology and all the things. And none of it is actually changing anything for me. Struggling with her mental health and, a sense of meaninglessness that is pretty hard to avoid if you're trying to live your life without God. And so, started coming to our church.
How did she find your church in particular?
She stalked me on Instagram and figured out where I went to church.
So she'd been reading or listening to some of your stuff.
She'd actually been listening to my podcast, the Confronting Christianity podcast. And it was so interesting because when I first met her, she said, your podcast helped me turn to Jesus. And I was like, oh, that's the best thing I've heard, and that makes it
that's
worth
the whole
it.
point.
That's the whole point of me. If all the work I've ever done for this podcast is just for you, that's enough. And a few weeks later, I said to her, was there a particular episode or a particular issue that really helped you? And she said no. Said I'd heard people talk about the kinds of things you're talking about, whether it's questions of sort of sexuality and gender or abortion or, all the things. But she said, I could hear the love in your voice as you talked about those things. And she was like, honestly, I hadn't heard that love in a lot of people's voices as they were talking. And she said that was what made the gospel real to me, that this is actually ultimately founded on love. And that's one of the most sort of moving conversations I've had recently of realizing, oh yeah, the fact that the New Testament calls us insistently to love one another and to love our neighbor and to love our enemies, which includes our ideological enemies, the fact that everything we should say and do must, if we're Christians, be steeped in love, is part and parcel of our testimony. A couple of weeks after she joined our church, I remember her coming to me and saying, I've just realized you guys have to love me. I could join any other group in Boston and they could decide that I'm weird and not want me anymore, but you guys don't have the choice. You have to love me. And I said, yeah, the problem is you have to love us too. Like that
It goes two ways.
But it's, I think in our current world that is really hurting. I mean, the levels of loneliness, of depression, of anxiety, of just addiction that we've seen. I mean, the Great Dechurching in the last couple of decades has come with massive upticks in depression, massive upticks in substance abuse, etc. And these are not uncorrelated, according to Tyler Vanderbilt's research. We have the answer in Jesus, and it's an answer that is embodied in the loving community of the church.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important thing to emphasize. How do you think in your own ministry about the process of speaking with somebody, of doing this evangelism and apologetics in a way that ultimately leads to sharing the hope of the gospel with them? You don't always start there, it seems, but you ultimately do want to get there.
Do you know, I often do pretty much start there. Because, I mean, in some ways, it's a straightforward starting point for me, because as soon as somebody asks me, what do you do? I then tell them, I write books about Jesus. So it's not a conversation I could avoid even if I wanted to. What I try to do, exceedingly imperfectly, is to make it evident from how I'm relating to somebody that I love and respect them. And that I, from the beginning, through the middle and right to the end, will only and ever be pointing them to Jesus. And I think actually the offensiveness of the gospel is so much more than any other potential offense that we might cause as a Christian. So, for example, the offensiveness of the Christian message when it comes to sexual ethics right now is nothing compared with the offense of the gospel itself, which says, you and I were so sinful that we needed Jesus to die for us because our sinful lives and hearts, I mean, it's sin that goes right down to the core of you and me. It's not just a sort of surface level problem. It's like I have sin bubbling up from my very heart, that I'm facing God's judgment, like I'm destined for hell apart from Christ. That's extraordinarily offensive.
So if that's true, though, why doesn't it seem to be more offensive, the story of Jesus and the fact that he came and he died for our sins? They wouldn't necessarily find that nearly as offensive as the idea that Christians don't believe that two women or two men should get married.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I think sexual ethics is one of the places where our culture finds Christianity to be most offensive, for sure. So, if I say I believe in Jesus, everyone around me in Cambridge, Massachusetts says, great, okay, I'm glad it makes you happy.
You do you.
If I say Jesus rose from the dead, they're like, I'm so glad you believe that. Kind of silly, but lovely.
Not offensive.
Even I wish I could believe in something lovely like that. If I say the reason Jesus died was because all of us are in fact destined for hell. And right now, however nice a person you might seem to be, or however nice a person I might seem to be, like I in and of myself am destined for hell. It's only because I'm hidden in Christ that I have hope in the coming judgment. That's offensive. I think that's where we as Christians, and I fully understand it, tend to veer away.
We sometimes use euphemisms. We don't really want to always say that clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I never want to say it. It's the last thing that I want to say, because it's exceedingly painful to think about, and exceedingly painful to share with somebody. But it's also the most loving thing that I can do. And in some ways, I feel like I keep kind of coming back to the questions of sexual ethics, because it is such a sort of flashpoint in our cultural conversations. But rather than dreading being asked questions about what Christians believe about same-sex marriage, etc., I actually more and more see that as an opportunity to say, yeah, Christianity is saying some really crazy things, like wild things. Like I had a conversation just a couple of weeks ago at a kid's birthday party with somebody I'd never met before. And we were talking. She had some Catholic background, but hadn't been to church in a long time. And as we were talking, it was evident that she was sort of interested in the possibility of church, and I had a sense of that she might like to start going to church. And I said, "Oh, we would love to have you come and check out our church if you're ever interested." And she said, "Sorry to ask a blunt question, but is your church inclusive of queer people?" And I said, "There's a long answer to that." And I talked her through all the people at our church, including my new young friend, who, were they not Christians, could easily be identified as queer or LGBT or one of the sort of under that umbrella. But because they're followers of Jesus, they're not. And, I said to her, at our church, we believe in crazy things like the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and like sex only in male-female marriage. That is actually
link those two things together,
because they're profoundly linked. I mean, if we look at what the Bible has to say about marriage, we'll find, as beautifully articulated in Ephesians 5, we'll find that actually Christian marriage is about Christ and the church.
Yeah. It's not just a random rule that God set up.
It's not just a random rule. It's not just a sort of conservative family values understanding. It's actually something much more weird and wonderful than that. And again, that's something that I sometimes say to people, like, Christian sexual ethics is much weirder than you think. It's not just that I believe sex only belongs in male-female marriage, but I believe this is all about a metaphor.
Yeah.
So it's actually about something much greater than itself. And then that reframes the whole conversation, because we're not trying to fit Christianity around the edges of what somebody already believes and sort of try to downplay the offensiveness of it. Instead, we're saying, do you know what? Christianity is making some wild claims on reality. And if you look at those claims carefully, one of the things you'll find is that love is staked right at the center of it. And many of the things that you might be longing for as a non-Christian, many of those things you'll actually find fulfilled in Christianity in ways that you didn't expect. It's making wild claims, but rather than Christianity being the only sort of belief system making wild claims, if you think about your own current belief system, you won't find that you're sort of believing a perfectly kind of coherent secular worldview that does all the work Christianity does without the crazy stuff. You'll find you're making, if anything, more crazy claims, like that a bunch of atoms and molecules have intrinsic value. Like you're living as if your life has any kind of meaning, when it doesn't. If there's no God, it just doesn't. Like, actually, depression is a perfectly
reasonable,
rational response to a world without God. It's not the response we need to have, because we actually have the potential to believe in a world that is oriented around love, where there is a massive story being told that we can actually be part of. But nihilism is the right conclusion, I think, from a world not only, and it's not just even a generic, there is no generic kind of idea of God, actually. I go back and forth on this with a young friend of mine who's not a Christian, who is sort of deeply believes in God and really wants to wants to be able to sort of reconcile in her mind different religious traditions that are all sort of maybe saying the same thing. And they're just
There's
not
big
actually.
differences.
Yeah, there's no kind of generic
Yeah.
God idea. There's actually the Christian claims are very specific and don't fit with any sort of store-bought, like
Yeah.
non-brand version, as it were. It's all about, it's sort of all or nothing on Jesus.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I love about this is rather than viewing some of these, even the kind of controversial moral issues, the things that for many of us as Christians, if someone were to ask the question, before I come to church with you, tell me if your church is inclusive, that might, we kind of get nervous. That's like the hardest question to ask. It seems like what you're saying, though, is you almost see those less as obstacles to overcome, but as opportunities.
Yeah.
Opportunities to actually take them deeper into the Christian faith, deeper into the core theological truths that we believe, and show why, if you got concerns about that, let me tell you about this. This is actually more fundamental.
Yeah, because you cannot explain Christian sexual ethics without the gospel. Because if you're trying to, it's not Christian sexual ethics. Because, according to the New Testament, it is about the gospel. It is about Jesus and his people in a one flesh everlasting union. It's about Jesus, dying for love of his people. And so we need to go straight there. And that's why it's an opportunity. Now, I do have the, I'm going to use the word blessing, I think, although I realize there's some complexities around that, because I for sure am not wanting to celebrate, for example, my own experience of same-sex attraction or the sort of sexual sin in the past of any of my Christian friends. Like, none of that is sort of good and to be rejoiced in. At the same time, my young friend who made the sinful and foolish decision to get like lesbian tattoos on her leg is now somebody I can point to for my non-believing friends and say, hey, you might think that the two options are sort of affirming of same-sex sexual relationships or bigots who just don't understand and are hateful. Those two options just aren't going to work if you look at my actual Christian community. Because you'll see person after person who has recognized that following Jesus is actually better than following your own sexual and romantic desires. And that's heresy in our world today, right? There's nothing better than following your sexual and romantic desires. And as Christians, we want to say, not the draw of sexual and romantic desires isn't strong, because probably for all of us, in one way or another, in one point of our life or other, it is strong.
We all struggle with sinful desires or urges.
But actually, Jesus has the right to tell us what to do with our bodies. He is the one person who knows the best and worst of our hearts, and he's the one person who has literally died for love of us. So if you're seeking love, look carefully, you might just find Jesus, and you might just find all of your other desires sort of relativized compared with him. And that's true. I think it's important to recognize that's not just true for people who are attracted to folks of their same sex. It's actually also true for people who are only ever attracted to somebody of the opposite sex, that if we orient our lives around fulfilling our sexual and romantic desires as like our highest goal and the thing, before which everything else must bow, we won't find ourselves worshipping Jesus. We may well find ourselves consuming pornography. We may well find ourselves in sexual romantic relationships that the Bible forbids. But we won't find ourselves on the sort of path of discipleship. And I think increasingly in our culture today, having a willingness and an ability within the church for all of us to kind of come clean about what we're struggling with, whether it's pornography, whether it's same-sex attraction, whether it's attraction to people of the opposite sex you're not married to, like whatever it is, whether it's alcohol abuse, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's addiction to social media, you name it, for all of us to be able to come alongside one another in those struggles against sin and to be the encouragement that we need. And I think that's actually an incredibly sort of mentally healthy community to be part of, because nobody's pretending. And, if your struggle is with depression, or your struggle is with anxiety, or just your struggle is with suicidal ideation, that should be something that we, as brothers and sisters in Christ, are able to come alongside one another and give each other the sort of love and encouragement that we need in the midst of all of those struggles.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe as a last question, Rebecca, some people have legitimately had really bad experiences with churches. And that can sometimes play a big part in people feeling like, I don't want anything to do with the church.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could speak to that kind of person listening, or maybe someone who knows someone who has had those kinds of experiences, and the thought of church being good for them is just so beyond the pale because of their own experiences. What would you say to someone who's in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, number one, it's vital that we acknowledge the sinful behaviors that we've seen in church, and the sinful cover up of abuse that's also been true of across the denominations. Actually, it's whether you're Catholic or Baptist or Anglican or you name it. There's I don't think there's a denomination that hasn't been touched by this, and we need to recognize the wrongness of that, and we need to recognize the wrongness of sort of complicity with abuse as well as the wrongness of abuse itself. And just like any other area in which the churches have been mired in sin, we diagnose that sin from Scripture. So that's true of the sort of history of racism. That's true of the history of Christians being genuinely hateful toward people who identify as LGB or T, which, as I say, if Jesus calls us to love our neighbor, to love our enemy, there's no category of people in your town or in your city or in your, the rural area where you're living who you're not called to love. And acting hatefully, genuinely hatefully towards people is not faithfully following Jesus and needs to be repented of. And so all of those things we diagnose from the pages of the Scriptures as sinful. I think two things that are really helpful to recognize. One is that if you read the New Testament, you will find that you should expect to see sin in the church. The New Testament does not include a bunch of letters to perfect churches.
Yeah, it's not a very rosy picture of the early church.
No, it's a bunch of letters to churches that are a hot mess. And Paul, for instance, will be calling on the one hand for profound unity, and on the other hand, calling for a clear condemnation of sexual sin. And that applies to sexual abuse. It also applies to any sort of sexual relationships outside of male-female marriage. But one of the interesting metaphors that the New Testament uses for the church is that it is a family. And I think that's something that we need to lean into and recognize far more than we do in our kind of modern Western culture, that rather than the church being composed of individual families, that actually we together, whether we're married or single or whatever our marital status is or whether we have children, et cetera, we are all a family together, sort of profoundly theologically important and pastorally significant. And when we realize that and we think about questions of abuse, the reality is a lot of people experience abuse in the context of their families. I mean, that's just the tragic reality that's the case. Few people would conclude from that family is bad. Instead, what we conclude from that is, man, family can be the most beautiful and life-giving and wonderful thing, and it can be a place where people experience horrific abuse. So what we need to put up significant guardrails against abuse in the family and in the family of the church. But we wouldn't want to throw out the family because of the evidence that many people who are abused in the context of their family. And likewise, all the data shows that throwing out the church because of the abuse that people have tragically, horrifically experienced in the context of church actually lands us in a far worse place. It's not the exit of the church is not the entry point to human flourishing and thriving and relief of depression and etc. It's actually on average the polar opposite. So for example, I'm raising 3 children in the church. One of the most dangerous things I could do for my kids is take them out of church.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for helping us to think about inviting people into the incredible community that we have as Christians.
Yes, because that beautiful community is what Jesus says is the mark of his disciples, that people will know that we are his disciples because of our love for one another, and we have the opportunity to invite other people into that.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was Rebecca McLaughlin on the benefits of being part of a local church. For more, check out her new book with Crossway, How Church Could Literally Save Your Life. Pick up a print copy of the book for 30% off, or get the ebook or audiobook for 50% off directly from Crossway by visiting crossway.org/plus. And if you like this interview, check out another conversation I had with Rebecca entitled, Is Christianity on the Decline? To listen, click the link in the show notes or search for the episode wherever you get your podcasts. For more audio content like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving us a review. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.